If someone were to sit down at a table 2,000 years ago, everything they thought they knew about food would be completely shattered. There were no refrigerators, no grocery stores, no processed sugar, no fast food chains on every corner, no frozen meals waiting in a freezer, no plastic packaging, nothing even remotely close to what the modern world considers a normal meal. And yet, millions of people not only survived, they thrived. They built entire civilizations. They raised children who grew strong. They fought wars that shaped empires. They wrote poetry and philosophy that still echoes through the centuries. They laid the very foundations of the world we walk through today. How people ate in biblical times is not just some dusty history lesson buried in old scrolls. It is a mirror. A mirror that forces anyone who looks into it to confront an uncomfortable truth: that humanity has drifted so far from the simplest, most essential act of existence: eating. And once a person truly understands what people put into their bodies during those ancient days, they will never look at their own plate the same way again. Picture this: a small village in the ancient land of Judea. The sun had barely cracked the horizon, and already the air was warm, dry, carrying the faint scent of dust and wild thyme across the hills. A man named Ezra rose from his sleeping mat on the floor of a modest stone house. There was no alarm clock, no phone buzzing on a nightstand. His body simply knew when the light changed, because for his entire life, every single day had been governed by the sun. Ezra was 32 years old, though by modern standards, his weathered face and calloused hands might have made him look closer to 50. He was a farmer. His father had been a farmer, his grandfather before that. And every generation stretching back as far as anyone could remember had lived and worked this same stretch of rocky, unforgiving earth on the outskirts of a village so small it barely had a name. Ezra did not think about breakfast the way a modern person would. He did not open a pantry stocked with cereals and snack bars. He did not pour milk from a carton or brew coffee from beans shipped across an ocean. Instead, he reached for a piece of flatbread that his wife, Miriam, had baked the evening before on a clay oven built into the side of their house. The bread was dense, coarse, made from barley flour that still had bits of grit in it from the grinding stone. It was not soft. It was not fluffy. It would not rise the way modern bread does, because there was no refined yeast, no commercial leavening agent. This was the bread of survival. And Ezra ate it the same way he ate it every single morning, tearing off a piece, dipping it into a small bowl of olive oil, and chewing slowly because wasting food was not just frowned upon. It was unthinkable. Bread was everything in the ancient world. It was not a side dish. It was not something a person casually tossed into a basket at the market. Bread was life itself. The word for bread in Hebrew, lechem, was so deeply embedded in the culture that it was practically synonymous with food in general. When someone said they were going to eat, what they really meant was they were going to eat bread. Everything else, the olive oil, the herbs, the occasional piece of dried fish, those were accompaniments. Bread was the foundation. And the process of making that bread was grueling in ways that most modern people cannot even begin to imagine. Every morning, long before the men went to the fields, women like Miriam would wake in the pre-dawn darkness to begin grinding grain. The tool was simple: 2 heavy stones, one flat and one rounded, and the grain was placed between them and crushed by hand back and forth over and over until it became something resembling flour. This was not a 5-minute task. Grinding enough grain to feed a family for one day could take an hour or more of continuous, exhausting labor. The flour was then mixed with water and a small amount of salt, if the family could afford salt, which was not always the case, and shaped into flat rounds that were pressed onto the scorching interior walls of a clay oven called a tanner. The entire process, from raw grain to finished bread, was a daily ritual that consumed a significant portion of a woman's waking hours. And it had to be done every single day because there was no way to preserve bread for more than a day or two before it became hard as rock or began to grow mold in the warm climate. Barley was the grain of the common people. Wheat existed, certainly, and wheat bread was considered far superior in taste and texture. But wheat was expensive. It required better soil, more water, and more careful cultivation. A wealthy merchant in Jerusalem might eat wheat bread daily without a second thought. But for a farmer like Ezra, barley was the reality. Barley bread was darker, heavier, and had a slightly bitter taste that modern palates would probably find unpleasant, but it was nutritious, it was filling, and it kept a working man's body moving through hours of backbreaking labor under a sun that showed no mercy. Miriam had learned to bake from her mother, who had learned from her mother before her. The knowledge was passed down not through books or recipes written on parchment, but through observation, repetition, and the quiet patience of women who understood that feeding a family was not a chore. It was an act of devotion. She knew exactly how much water to add to the flour so the dough would hold together without becoming too sticky. She knew how to read the heat of the oven by holding her hand near its opening. She knew that if the bread was left too long, it would burn and become useless, and if pulled too soon, the center would remain raw and cause stomach pain. These were not trivial skills. In a world without thermometers, timers, or written instructions, the ability to consistently produce edible bread was a form of expertise that commanded deep respect within the household, and bread was only the beginning. Olive oil was the second pillar of the ancient diet, and its importance cannot be overstated. In a world without butter, without vegetable oil, without cooking spray or margarine, olive oil was the universal fat. It was used for cooking, for flavoring, for preserving food, for fueling lamps, for medicinal purposes, and even for personal hygiene. A family's olive oil supply was one of its most valuable possessions, and the olive trees that produced it were treated with a reverence that bordered on sacred. An olive tree could live for hundreds of years, and many families in Judea tended trees that had been planted by their great-great-grandparents. To cut down an olive tree was considered an act of destruction so severe that it could provoke community outrage. These trees were not just agricultural assets. They were inheritance. They were legacy. They were living connections to ancestors who had long since returned to the dust. The process of making olive oil was labor-intensive but straightforward. Ripe olives were harvested in the autumn, typically by beating the branches with long sticks until the fruit fell to the ground or onto cloth spread beneath the trees. The olives were then collected, washed, and crushed in a stone press, a heavy cylindrical stone that rolled over the olives in a basin, breaking them into a pulp. The pulp was placed into woven baskets and stacked, and more weight was applied from above, slowly squeezing out the precious oil. The first pressing produced the highest quality oil, rich, green, intensely flavored. Subsequent pressings yielded oil of decreasing quality, which was used for cooking, for lamps, or traded at a lower price. A family with a good grove of olive trees and a well-maintained press was considered comfortable, even prosperous. Oil was liquid wealth, and it flowed through the economy of the ancient world like currency. Ezra's family had a small grove, perhaps 15 trees, that his father had expanded from an original planting of just 5. It was not enough to make them wealthy, but it was enough to ensure they always had oil for their bread, oil for their lamps, and a small surplus to trade at the village market for things they could not produce themselves. Miriam used the oil in almost everything she prepared. She drizzled it over bread. She cooked lentils in it. She rubbed it into the skin of her children to protect them from the harsh sun. When one of the children developed a cough, she mixed oil with wild honey and had the child swallow it slowly. Olive oil was not a luxury in the ancient world. It was as essential as water. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque aqui você não apenas assiste histórias, você viaja no tempo e descobre verdades sobre a humanidade que ninguém mais vai te contar. Se inscreva agora e ative o sininho para não perder nenhum capítulo. The morning meal, if it could even be called a meal, was quick and modest. Ezra took his bread and oil, perhaps a handful of dried figs or a few olives that had been cured in salt. That was it. There was no lingering at the table, no leisurely brunch, no second cup of anything. The day's work was waiting, and in the ancient world, work did not wait for anyone. The fields needed tending. The animals needed feeding. The irrigation channels needed clearing. Every hour of daylight was precious, and wasting it was a sin against the very land that kept the family alive. The main meal of the day, the one that most closely resembled what modern people would call dinner, was eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, after the hardest work was done. This was the meal the entire family gathered for, and it was the one Miriam spent the most time preparing. But even this meal, by modern standards, would seem shockingly simple. The centerpiece was almost always a stew or a thick pottage, a slow-cooked mixture of lentils, beans, onions, garlic, and whatever vegetables were in season. Lentils were the protein staple of the poor. They were cheap, easy to grow, easy to store, and when cooked properly, they were filling and nutritious. A pot of lentil stew could feed an entire family for a fraction of the cost of meat, and in most households across Judea, Galilee, and the surrounding regions, lentils appeared on the table far more often than any animal protein. The vegetables available were limited by season and geography, but they were diverse enough to provide variety. Onions and garlic were used in almost every dish, not just for flavor, but because ancient people understood, even without modern science, that these foods seemed to promote health and vitality. Leeks, cucumbers, and various leafy greens were common during the growing season. Beans, particularly broad beans, were cultivated widely and served as another critical source of protein and fiber. Root vegetables were less common than one might expect, as the soil in many parts of the ancient Near East was rocky and shallow, making it difficult to grow deep-rooted crops. But where conditions allowed, turnips and certain types of radishes supplemented the diet. Herbs and spices played a role that went far beyond simple seasoning. In a world without sugar, without rich sauces, without the vast array of flavoring options available today, herbs were what made the difference between a bland meal and one that satisfied the soul. Cumin was perhaps the most widely used spice in the ancient Near East. Its warm, earthy flavor appeared in stews, on bread, and in preserved foods. Coriander, both the seeds and the fresh leaves, was equally popular. Dill, mint, mustard seed, and black cumin were all cultivated or gathered wild and used regularly. Salt, of course, was the most essential seasoning of all, but it was also one of the most expensive. Salt had to be mined or evaporated from seawater, and its transportation added to its cost. For a poor family, salt was used sparingly and carefully, never wasted, never taken for granted. The expression about salt losing its flavor that appears in ancient texts was not a casual metaphor. It reflected a real concern about the quality and purity of a substance that was both precious and essential. Meat was rare. This is one of the most striking differences between the ancient diet and the modern one, and it is a fact that surprises many people. In the contemporary world, meat is eaten daily, sometimes at every meal, and in quantities that would have seemed obscene to an ancient person. But 2,000 years ago, for ordinary people like Ezra and his family, meat was a special occasion food. It appeared on the table during religious festivals, during celebrations like weddings, or when a guest of honor visited the household. The rest of the time, animal protein came in smaller, less dramatic forms: a piece of dried fish, an egg from the family's chickens, or a cup of goat's milk. The reasons for this were practical, not ideological. Animals were far too valuable to slaughter casually. A goat provided milk for years, a sheep provided wool season after season, an ox could plow fields, chickens laid eggs. Killing an animal for a single meal meant sacrificing years of future productivity, and no sensible farmer would do that without a very good reason. When an animal was slaughtered, it was typically a communal event. The meat was shared among extended family members and neighbors, and every part of the animal was used. The meat was roasted or stewed, the bones were boiled for broth, the hide was tanned for leather, the fat was rendered for cooking and lamp fuel, and the organs were eaten as delicacies. Nothing was wasted, absolutely nothing. Fish was more accessible than red meat for people living near the Sea of Galilee or along the Mediterranean coast. The fishing industry around the Sea of Galilee was substantial, and fish from those waters, species like tilapia and sardines, were a significant source of protein for the surrounding population. Fish could be eaten fresh if one lived close enough to the water, but for inland communities, fish was preserved through salting and drying. Salted fish could last for weeks or even months, making it a practical trade commodity that reached villages far from any body of water. The town of Magdala, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, was famous throughout the region for its fish processing industry. The name Magdala itself may derive from a word meaning tower, possibly referencing the towers used for drying fish in the sun. The salted fish produced there was traded across the entire region, and it was one of the most important protein sources for inland communities that had no access to fresh seafood. But even fish was not an everyday food for most people. It was more common than meat, certainly, but still reserved for days when the family could afford to purchase it, or when a local fisherman had a surplus to share. The daily reality for most families was plant-based: bread, lentils, beans, vegetables, olive oil, and fruit. This was not a choice driven by philosophy or ethics. It was simply the economic reality of a world where animal products were expensive and plant foods were abundant and affordable. Dairy products occupied an interesting middle ground. Goat's milk was the most common form of dairy, as goats were hardier, cheaper to maintain, and better suited to the rocky terrain of Judea than cattle. Cow's milk existed but was less common and more associated with wealthier households or regions with better pasture land. Milk was consumed fresh, but it spoiled quickly in the warm climate, so much of it was processed into other forms. Yogurt-like preparations were common. Milk was allowed to ferment naturally in skin bags or clay pots, producing a tangy, thick substance that lasted longer than fresh milk and was easier to digest. Cheese, particularly soft, fresh cheese similar to modern cottage cheese or farmer's cheese, was made by curdling milk with natural acids or rennet and then straining the curds. Hard-aged cheeses, while they existed in some parts of the ancient world, were less common in the Near East than in cooler European climates where aging conditions were more favorable. Butter was known but not widely used in the way modern Western cultures use it. The warm climate made butter difficult to store, and olive oil served most of the culinary functions that butter serves today. When butter was made, it was often clarified, heated until the milk solids separated and could be removed, producing a form of ghee that was more stable in warm temperatures. This clarified butter was considered a delicacy and was sometimes offered as a gift to honored guests or used in special dishes during festivals. Eggs were a welcome addition to the diet whenever they were available. Most families kept a small flock of chickens, perhaps 5 or 10 birds, that roamed freely around the house and yard, scratching in the dirt for insects and seeds. The eggs they produced were not the large, uniform, white-shelled eggs found in modern supermarkets. They were smaller, with shells that ranged in color from pale cream to speckled brown, and the yolks were a deep, rich orange from the varied natural diet of the birds. Eggs were typically eaten boiled or cooked directly on a hot stone or in a small clay dish over coals. They were a quick, convenient source of protein and fat, and in many households, collecting eggs each morning was a task assigned to the children. Fruit was one of the genuine pleasures of the ancient diet, and the land of the Near East produced an abundance of it. Figs, grapes, pomegranates, and dates were the most important fruits, and each played a distinct role in daily nutrition and cultural life. Figs were perhaps the most beloved fruit of the ancient world. Fig trees grew easily in the Mediterranean climate, required relatively little care, and produced generous harvests. Fresh figs were eaten during the summer months, soft, sweet, deeply satisfying. But fresh figs did not last. They had to be eaten within days of picking or they would spoil. To preserve them for the rest of the year, figs were dried in the sun on flat rooftops or stone surfaces, then pressed into dense cakes that could be stored for months. Dried fig cakes were a staple food, portable, calorie-dense, and naturally sweet. They were carried by travelers, packed in the bags of merchants crossing long trade routes, and stored in household pantries as an emergency food supply. A family with a productive fig tree and a good supply of dried figs felt a measure of security that was hard to achieve any other way. Grapes were equally important, though their significance went far beyond simply eating fresh fruit. While fresh grapes were certainly enjoyed during the harvest season, the most important product of the grape harvest was wine. Wine was not a luxury beverage in the ancient world. It was a daily necessity. Water sources were often unreliable, and even seemingly clean water could carry invisible dangers that caused illness. The fermentation process that turned grape juice into wine produced alcohol, which acted as a natural purifier, making wine safer to drink than water in many situations. Virtually everyone drank wine: men, women, and even children, though children's wine was typically diluted with a higher proportion of water. The wine of the ancient world was quite different from what modern wine drinkers are accustomed to. It was often thick, intensely flavored, and almost always diluted with water before drinking. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, a sign of excess and lack of self-control. The standard practice was to mix 1 part wine with 2 or 3 parts water, producing a mildly alcoholic beverage that was refreshing, safe to drink, and provided a modest caloric supplement to the diet. Wine was also used in cooking, in religious rituals, and as a base for medicinal preparations. Herbs and spices were sometimes added to wine to create flavored varieties, and vinegar, wine that had gone sour, was used as a condiment, a preservative, and a cleaning agent. Nothing was wasted, even wine that had turned. The grape harvest in autumn was one of the most important events of the agricultural year. Entire families, and often entire communities, worked together to pick the grapes, transport them to the wine press, and begin the crushing process. Wine presses were typically carved directly into bedrock, large flat basins where the grapes were dumped and then crushed by foot. The juice flowed through a channel into a lower collection basin, where it was gathered into large clay jars and left to ferment. The fermentation process took several weeks, and the resulting wine was then transferred to smaller jars or skin bags for storage and transportation. The skins and pulp left over from pressing were not discarded. They were sometimes eaten, fed to animals, or used to make a secondary weaker drink by adding water and allowing a second fermentation. Agora, deixe comentário dizendo: eu nunca mais vou olhar para a minha comida da mesma forma, porque essa é a verdade que essa história nos ensina, e eu quero saber se você também sentiu isso. Pomegranates held a special place in the culture and cuisine of the ancient Near East. With their jewel-like seeds and sweet tart juice, pomegranates were associated with beauty, fertility, and abundance. They were eaten fresh, their seeds scooped out and savored one by one, or their juice was extracted and used as a flavoring in both food and drink. Pomegranate juice could also be reduced into a thick syrup, a concentrated sweetener that added depth and complexity to dishes. The fruit appeared frequently in art, in decorative motifs on buildings and textiles, and in religious symbolism. Pomegranate trees were cultivated in gardens and orchards throughout the region, and a household with pomegranate trees was considered blessed. Dates were the sweetener of the ancient world. In an era without refined sugar, without high fructose corn syrup, without artificial sweeteners, dates provided the most concentrated source of natural sweetness available. They grew abundantly in the warmer, drier regions, particularly in the Jordan Valley and around Jericho, where the climate was ideally suited to date palm cultivation. Fresh dates were a seasonal treat, but like figs, they were most commonly consumed in dried form. Dried dates were incredibly calorie-dense, packed with natural sugars, fiber, and minerals. They were eaten as snacks, pressed into cakes, and used to make a thick, dark syrup called date honey, Ceylon in Hebrew, that was drizzled over bread, stirred into porridge, and used as a sweetener in cooking. When ancient texts spoke of a land flowing with milk and honey, many scholars believe the honey referred to was not bee honey, but this date syrup, the thick, sweet essence of the fruit that grew so abundantly in the fertile lowlands. Bee honey did exist, of course, and it was highly prized. Wild honey was gathered from hives found in rock crevices, hollow trees, and cliff faces, a dangerous and difficult task that required courage and skill. Beekeeping, in a domesticated sense, was practiced in some areas, with hives made from clay cylinders stacked horizontally, but the practice was not as widespread as it would become in later centuries. Honey was expensive, far more costly than date syrup, and it was often reserved for special occasions, for medicinal use or as a trade commodity. The taste of wild honey, complex, floral, deeply aromatic, was considered one of the finest flavors the natural world had to offer, and finding a wild hive was considered a stroke of remarkable good fortune. Nuts were another important component of the ancient diet. Almonds, walnuts, and pistachios all grew in the region and were consumed regularly. Almonds were particularly significant. Almond trees were among the first to bloom each spring, their delicate pink and white blossoms appearing before any other tree showed signs of life. This early blooming made the almond tree a symbol of watchfulness and hope. The nuts themselves were eaten raw, roasted, or ground into a paste that could be mixed with honey to create a primitive form of confection. Walnuts were prized for their rich, fatty flavor and were sometimes pressed to extract oil. Pistachios, while less common than almonds, were a valued trade item and a favorite snack among those who could afford them. Seeds, particularly sesame seeds, also played a role in the diet. Sesame was one of the oldest cultivated crops in the world, and sesame oil was used alongside olive oil in some regions for cooking and flavoring. Sesame seeds were sprinkled on bread, mixed into pastes, and used in various preparations that provided additional fat and protein to a diet that was otherwise quite lean. Water was the most basic and essential element of daily life, and yet it was also one of the most challenging to secure. In the arid climate of the ancient Near East, water was never taken for granted. Rainfall was seasonal, concentrated in the winter months, and during the long, dry summers, water sources could shrink to a trickle or disappear entirely. Communities were built around water, near springs, wells, rivers, or cisterns that had been carved into rock to collect and store rainwater. The location of a reliable water source could determine the fate of an entire village. A spring that dried up or a well that went bad could force a community to relocate or face devastating consequences. Cisterns were engineering marvels of simplicity. They were essentially underground chambers, hewn from limestone bedrock or lined with waterproof plaster, designed to collect rainwater during the wet season and store it for use throughout the year. Every household aspired to have its own cistern, and many did. The water collected in cisterns was not always clean by modern standards. It could develop algae, harbor insects, and accumulate sediment over time. But it was water, and in a land where water was life, even imperfect water was precious beyond measure. Families developed methods for filtering cistern water through layers of cloth or sand to remove the worst of the sediment, and the addition of wine or vinegar to water was partly a practical measure to mask the taste of stored water and partly a sanitary precaution. Wells were another critical water source, particularly for larger communities. Digging a well was a major undertaking. It required identifying a location where groundwater was accessible, then excavating down through soil and rock until the water table was reached. Wells were community resources, and access to them was governed by social custom and, in some cases, formal agreements. Disputes over well rights could be intense, even violent, because control of a water source was control of survival itself. The stories in ancient texts about conflicts over wells are not exaggerations. They reflect a reality in which water was more valuable than gold. Springs were the most prized water sources of all. A natural spring, water emerging fresh and cool from the earth, was considered a gift of extraordinary value. Settlements that grew up around springs often became important towns or cities. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, owed its existence to a powerful spring that provided abundant water in the middle of an otherwise harsh desert landscape. The water from a good spring was clean, constant, and reliable, requiring no cistern, no well, no storage. It simply flowed, day after day, year after year, sustaining life in a place where life should not have been possible. The daily routine of water collection was typically a woman's task, and it was one of the most social activities in village life. Women would go to the well or spring in the morning or evening, the cooler parts of the day, carrying large clay jars balanced on their heads or shoulders. The walk to the water source could be short or it could be considerable, depending on the village's geography, and the jars, when filled, were heavy. But the trip to the well was also a time for conversation, for gossip, for the exchange of news and stories that knit a community together. It was at the well that women learned who was ill, who had given birth, who was getting married, and what travelers had been seen on the road. The well was not just a water source, it was the social heart of the village. Cooking technology was primitive, but effective. The primary cooking tool was the clay oven, the tanner, a cylindrical structure made from clay and straw, usually about 3 feet tall, with an opening at the top and a fire pit at the base. The tanner was used primarily for baking bread, but it could also be used to roast small amounts of meat or to heat pots of stew placed on top. Some households had smaller portable clay stoves that could be moved around as needed, and cooking was also done over open fires using tripods to support pots and pans. Fuel was a constant concern. Wood was available but not always abundant, especially in areas where forests had been cleared for agriculture. Dried animal dung, particularly from cattle and camels, was a commonly used fuel that burned steadily and hot, and its use was completely unremarkable to ancient people. Charcoal, produced by slowly burning wood in a low-oxygen environment, was prized for its clean, hot flame and was used for more delicate cooking tasks, but it was more expensive and time-consuming to produce than raw wood or dung. The cooking pots themselves were made of clay, thick-walled vessels that could withstand the heat of open flames, but were fragile and had to be replaced regularly. A household's collection of cooking pots, storage jars, bowls, and plates represented a significant investment, and a woman who was skilled at maintaining her household's pottery supply, knowing how to handle the vessels carefully, when to retire a cracked pot before it shattered, and how to season new pots to prevent food from sticking, was valued for her practical wisdom. Wealthier households might possess a few items made of bronze or copper, a good knife, a serving platter, perhaps a large cooking pot. But metal cookware was expensive and far beyond the reach of most ordinary families. Food storage was a critical challenge in a world without refrigeration. In the warm climate of the Near East, fresh food spoiled quickly, and the development of preservation techniques was not a luxury, but a survival necessity. Salt was the primary preservative. Fish were gutted, packed in salt, and dried in the sun. Olives were cured in salt or brine. Vegetables could be pickled in vinegar or preserved in olive oil. Grain, when properly dried and stored in sealed jars or in underground silos, could last for years, a fact that was crucial for surviving years when the harvest was poor. Dried fruits, dried beans, and dried herbs all kept well in the warm, dry climate, and a well-stocked pantry of preserved foods was a family's best insurance against the uncertainty of the next growing season. Underground storage spaces, carved from rock or dug into the earth, provided cooler temperatures for storing perishable items. Some households had small cellars or storage rooms built partially below ground level, where the natural insulation of the earth kept temperatures several degrees cooler than the surface. These spaces were used to store wine, olive oil, grains, and preserved foods, and maintaining them, keeping them dry, free of pests, and properly ventilated, was an ongoing task that required attention and knowledge. The social dimension of food in the ancient world was profoundly different from modern dining culture. Eating was not a private act. It was a communal experience, deeply embedded in social customs, religious obligations, and family bonds. The evening meal was the primary social event of the day, and it was eaten not at individual place settings around a table with chairs, but on the floor, around a low surface or mat, with the food placed in communal bowls and dishes from which everyone ate together. The family sat in a specific order that reflected the social hierarchy of the household. The father sat in the position of honor. The mother sat nearby, often continuing to serve food even as she ate. Children sat according to age, with the eldest closest to the father. Guests, if present, were seated according to their status, and the treatment of guests was governed by elaborate customs of hospitality that were considered sacred obligations. To welcome a stranger into one's home, to offer them food and drink and a place to rest, was not merely polite, it was a moral duty. The failure to show hospitality was considered a serious moral failing, a stain on the character of the host and the reputation of the household. When guests arrived, the rituals of hospitality followed a predictable pattern. Water was offered for washing the hands and feet, essential in a dusty, sandal-wearing culture where the roads were unpaved. Oil might be offered for anointing the head and face, a gesture of respect and welcome. Then food was brought, and it was always the best the household could offer. Even a poor family would prepare their finest dishes for a guest, sometimes going without themselves to ensure that the visitor was properly fed. This was not a burden. It was an honor. The guest brought news from the outside world, stories from distant places, and the social prestige of having hosted a traveler. In return, the guest was expected to be gracious, complimentary of the food, and respectful of the household's customs. Eating was done with the hands. There were no forks, no spoons for individual use in most common households. Bread served as the primary utensil. A piece torn from the communal loaf was used to scoop up stew, to pinch olives, to wrap around a piece of cheese or a morsel of fish. The right hand was always used for eating, as the left hand was considered unclean in many ancient cultures. Stews and thick porridges were eaten by dipping bread into the communal pot, and the pace of eating was governed by social custom. Eating too quickly was rude. Eating too slowly could be seen as disinterest in the host's food. Conversation flowed during the meal, and the topics ranged from the practical, the state of the crops, the price of oil at the market, to the philosophical and spiritual, particularly on religious festival days when the family gathered to reflect on their faith and history. The marketplace was another crucial element of the ancient food system. While most families grew or raised much of their own food, no household was entirely self-sufficient. There were always items that needed to be purchased or traded: salt, certain spices, dried fish for inland communities, wine for those who did not have their own vineyards, metal tools, clay pots, and textiles. Village markets were held on specific days of the week, and larger towns and cities had permanent marketplaces. Bustling, noisy, vibrant spaces where merchants displayed their goods on stone counters or woven mats spread on the ground. The market was a sensory experience that overwhelmed every sense. The smell of fresh bread mingling with the sharp tang of aged cheese. The shouts of merchants advertising their wares. The sight of baskets overflowing with dates, figs, pomegranates, and almonds. The feel of rough linen and smooth pottery beneath the fingertips. The taste of a sample offered by a wine merchant eager to make a sale. Haggling was expected. It was not just a commercial transaction, but a social ritual, a form of communication between buyer and seller that established relationships and reinforced community bonds. A person who paid the first price asked without negotiating was either a fool or a stranger, and a merchant who did not expect to negotiate was not worth doing business with. The food supply chain in the ancient world was remarkably complex, even without modern transportation infrastructure. Goods moved along trade routes that connected distant regions, carried by caravans of donkeys and camels that traversed deserts, mountains, and valleys to bring products from one market to another. Spices from the east, cinnamon, black pepper, saffron, traveled thousands of miles along overland routes before reaching the markets of Jerusalem or Damascus. These exotic spices were fantastically expensive and available only to the wealthy, but their existence in the marketplace reflected a global trade network that was, in its own way, as sophisticated as anything the modern world has produced. Salt came from the Dead Sea, a body of water so saturated with minerals that nothing could live in it, but which produced salt of extraordinary quality. The salt was harvested from the shores in shallow pools where the water evaporated, leaving behind crystalline deposits. It was then packed into bags and transported by donkey to markets throughout the region. The salt trade was a significant economic force, and control of salt production and distribution was a source of both wealth and political power. Grain was traded in enormous quantities. Egypt, with its fertile Nile River valley, was the breadbasket of the ancient Mediterranean world. Egyptian grain, primarily wheat, was shipped across the sea to feed populations in Rome, Greece, and throughout the coastal cities of the Near East. The grain trade was so vital to the stability of the Roman Empire that disruptions in the supply could cause riots in Rome itself. The entire logistical system, the farming, the harvesting, the transportation by river and sea, the storage in massive granaries at port cities, was an achievement of organizational complexity that rivaled any modern supply chain. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of ancient eating habits was what was completely absent from the table. There was no sugar, no refined crystalline sugar of the kind that saturates the modern diet. Sweetness came only from fruits, honey, and date syrup, and it was consumed in quantities that were a tiny fraction of what the average person consumes today. The human body in biblical times was simply not exposed to the relentless flood of sugar that characterizes modern nutrition, and the consequences of this difference were profound. Dental problems, while not unknown, were far less severe than they became in later centuries when sugar consumption exploded. Obesity was extraordinarily rare, a condition so unusual that it was specifically noted in ancient texts when it occurred, usually in reference to kings or extremely wealthy individuals who had access to unlimited food. The average person was lean, muscular from constant physical labor, and maintained a body weight that modern nutritionists would consider ideal. There were no processed foods. Every single item that entered the body was whole, natural, and minimally altered from its original state. Bread was made from whole grain, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm all included. because there was no technology to refine flour the way modern mills do. The fiber content of the ancient diet was astronomically high compared to modern standards, and this alone had significant health implications. Digestive health, the composition of gut bacteria, and the slow, steady release of energy from high-fiber foods meant that the blood sugar spikes and crashes that plague modern eaters simply did not occur. People ate, they felt satisfied, they worked, and they did not think about food again until the next meal. There were no artificial colors, no preservatives beyond salt and natural acids, no flavor enhancers, no emulsifiers, no stabilizers, no hydrogenated fats, no trans fats, no high-fructose corn syrup, no monosodium glutamate, no aspartame, no xanthan gum, no carrageenan. The ingredient list of any food item in the ancient world would have been absurdly short by modern standards. Flour, water, salt, oil, that was bread. Olives, salt, water, that was cured olives. Grapes, that was wine. The simplicity was not a limitation. It was a purity that the modern world has lost almost entirely. There were no stimulants in the morning, no coffee. Coffee beans would not be discovered as a beverage for another 1,000 years. No tea. Tea drinking was a Chinese tradition that had not yet reached the Western world. No chocolate. Cacao was an American crop, unknown in the Old World. The ancient person woke up, drank water or diluted wine, ate their bread, and went to work. Their energy came from food, from sleep, and from the natural rhythms of a body that had not been conditioned to depend on caffeine or sugar for motivation. The health implications of the ancient diet are a subject of intense modern interest, and for good reason. While it would be foolish to romanticize a world where infant death was common, where a simple infection could be fatal, and where malnutrition due to crop failure was a constant threat, it is equally foolish to ignore the evidence that the basic dietary pattern of the ancient world, whole grains, olive oil, legumes, vegetables, fruits, small amounts of dairy, occasional fish, and rare meat, is remarkably close to what modern nutritional science now considers the optimal diet for human health. The so-called Mediterranean diet, which has been extensively studied and consistently shown to reduce the risk of heart disease, certain forms of chronic illness, and cognitive decline, is essentially a modern version of the diet that ordinary people in the biblical world ate every single day, not because they had read a nutrition study, but because it was all that was available. Ezra did not know what a calorie was. He had never heard of a vitamin. He could not have explained the difference between a protein and a carbohydrate, but his body knew. His body, fed on whole barley bread, rich olive oil, earthy lentil stew, sweet dried figs, tangy goat's milk, and the occasional piece of salted fish, functioned with an efficiency that modern bodies stuffed with processed food and stripped of physical labor can only envy. He slept deeply because his body was genuinely tired from a full day of physical work. He ate with gratitude because he understood, in a way that modern abundance has erased, that food was not guaranteed. Every meal was a small miracle, the culmination of months of labor, the cooperation of sun and rain, the health of the soil, and the grace of forces beyond human control. Miriam, standing in the doorway of their stone house as the evening light turned the hills to gold, watched her children eating their bread and lentils with the unself-conscious appetite of youth. She did not know that 2,000 years in the future, people would eat things that contained ingredients they could not pronounce, that food would come in bright plastic packages covered in words like natural flavor and enriched and fortified, that children would prefer sweet drinks to water and processed snacks to fruit, that people would spend billions trying to lose weight they had gained by eating food their bodies were never designed to process. She did not know any of this. She knew only that her family was fed, that the bread was good, that the oil was rich, and that tomorrow, if the rain came as expected, the barley would grow another inch taller in the field. The ancient world was not paradise. Life was hard. Physical labor was relentless. Uncertainty was constant. A bad harvest could mean hunger. A prolonged drought could mean disaster. Illness could strike without warning and without remedy. But within this harsh reality, there was a relationship with food that was honest, direct, and deeply human. People knew where their food came from because they grew it, harvested it, prepared it, and shared it with their own hands. There was no mystery, no distance between the eater and the eaten. A loaf of bread was not a product. It was the tangible result of a year's worth of work, hope, and faith. And perhaps that is the most important lesson that the eating habits of biblical times have to offer the modern world. Not that we should abandon our refrigerators and grocery stores, not that we should grind our own grain by hand or press our own olives, but that we should remember what food actually is. Not a convenience, not an entertainment, not a source of comfort or distraction, but a connection. A connection to the earth that grows it, to the hands that prepare it, to the people who share it, and to the long, unbroken chain of human beings who, for thousands of years, turned the simple act of eating into an expression of community, gratitude, and love. Ezra finished his bread. He wiped the last of the olive oil from the bowl with his fingers and licked them clean. He looked at Miriam, at his children, at the small stone house that sheltered them, and at the darkening sky above, where the first stars were beginning to appear. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The meal was finished. The day was ending. Tomorrow would begin again with the same bread, the same oil, the same work, the same sun. And in that simple, ancient rhythm, there was a peace that 2,000 years of progress has never managed to improve upon. 2,000 years. That is how long it has been since people like Ezra and Miriam sat on the floor of a stone house and shared a meal of barley bread and lentil stew. 2,000 years of invention, innovation, revolution, and transformation. We have built cities that touch the sky. We have sent machines to other planets. We have connected every corner of the earth with invisible signals that carry words and images at the speed of light. And yet, when it comes to the most basic human act, feeding ourselves, we have in many ways gone backward. We eat more than any generation in human history, and yet we are less nourished. We have more choices than any civilization has ever known, and yet we are less satisfied. We spend less time preparing food than any people who have ever lived, and yet we are more anxious about what we eat than our ancestors could have imagined. The people of biblical times did not have our abundance. They did not have our technology. They did not have our knowledge. But they had something that we have lost. They had a relationship with food that was rooted in reality, in the soil, in the seasons, in the labor of their hands, and in the bonds of family and community. They knew what it meant to be hungry, and so they knew what it meant to be fed. They knew what it cost to produce a loaf of bread, and so they knew its value. They ate simply, not because they chose simplicity, but because simplicity was all there was. And in that simplicity, there was a wisdom that the modern world, drowning in options and overwhelmed by excess, desperately needs to rediscover. This is the food reality of 2,000 years ago. This is what people actually ate when the foundations of Western civilization were being laid. Barley bread torn by calloused hands. Olive oil pressed from trees planted by grandfathers. Lentil stew stirred over a dung-fueled fire. Figs dried on a rooftop in the blazing sun. Wine diluted with water drawn from a well dug by an entire community working together. Goat cheese made in a clay pot by a woman who had learned the technique from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before her. This was not a diet. It was a way of life. And it sustained not just bodies, but civilizations. Empires rose and fell on the strength of grain and oil. Wars were fought over salt and water. Trade routes spanning thousands of miles existed to carry spices and fish and wine from one market to another. The entire economy, the entire social structure, the entire rhythm of daily existence revolved around the production, preparation, and sharing of food. And at the center of it all, in every village, in every household, in every family, there was a table. Not a table in the modern sense, not a piece of furniture with legs and chairs arranged around it, but a space, a gathering place, a moment in the day when work stopped and family came together, where bread was broken and stories were told, where children learned the customs of their people and elders passed down the wisdom of their years, where gratitude was expressed, not as a formality, but as a genuine recognition that the food before them was not guaranteed, that it had come at great cost, and that sharing it was an act of love. That table still exists. It exists in every home, in every culture, in every corner of the modern world. But too often, it sits empty. Too often, meals are eaten alone, in front of screens in cars, standing at counters, distracted and hurried. Too often, the food on our plates is a mystery, assembled in factories from ingredients we cannot identify, shipped from places we have never seen, produced by processes we do not understand. We have gained so much in 2,000 years, but we have also lost something. Something simple, something essential, something that Ezra and Miriam understood without ever having to think about it. Food is not just fuel. It is a story. A story of the land that grew it, the hands that shaped it, the fire that cooked it, and the people who gathered to share it. Every meal is a chapter in that story. And the story of how people ate in biblical times is not just a tale of the past. It is a reminder that the most advanced technology in the world cannot replace the warmth of a shared meal. That the most sophisticated food science cannot improve upon a ripe fig eaten in the shade of a tree. That the most elaborate restaurant menu cannot match the satisfaction of bread baked by someone who loves you, shared with the people you love, at the end of a day spent doing meaningful work. Ezra's world is gone. The stone houses have crumbled. The olive trees have been replaced by other trees, or by buildings, or by roads. The clay ovens have turned to dust. The lentil fields have been built over by cities. But the hunger remains. Not the physical hunger that drove Ezra to his morning bread, but a deeper hunger. A hunger for connection, for simplicity, for the feeling that what we eat matters, that it means something, that it ties us to something larger than ourselves. 2,000 years from now, someone might look back at the way we eat today. Our plastic-wrapped, chemically preserved, industrially produced, individually consumed meals, and feel the same sense of wonder and sadness that we feel when we look back at Ezra's world. They might shake their heads at our wastefulness, our disconnection, our failure to appreciate what was right in front of us. Or perhaps by then, we will have remembered. Perhaps we will have found our way back to the table, back to the bread, back to the simple ancient truth that food is not just what we eat, it is who we are. How people ate in biblical times, daily nutrition and food reality around 2,000 years ago. Now you know. And now, the only question is, what will you do with what you have learned? Will you look at your next meal differently? Will you pause, even for a moment, to consider the miracle of the food before you? Will you sit down, put away your phone, look at the people across the table, break your bread, and be grateful? Ezra would. Miriam would. And perhaps, in that small act, you can carry their story forward for another 2,000 years. If you watched all the way to this point, it's because you truly enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and find out who really loves the stories on this channel. If this story made you think, if for just a moment you felt the weight of that barley bread in your hands or the heat of that clay oven, then leave your like. That like is what keeps this channel alive and allows me to keep bringing these stories to you. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who needs to remember what really matters when it comes to eating, share this video now. Send it to that person. You might change the way someone looks at their own plate today. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit the bell. Because every week this channel brings you stories that will change the way you see the world. I'll see you in the next video.